The date was July 13th, 1788. It started as a darkening of the sky over the French countryside. To the peasants working the fields of the Paris basin, it looked like a summer storm. But what fell from the heavens that afternoon was not rain. It was ice. Hailstones the size of quart bottles crashed down with the force of artillery fire. In the span of 60 minutes, the single most productive wheat harvest in the history of France was pulverized into mud. This was not just bad weather. It was the ignition switch for the end of a world. At that moment, the Kingdom of France was the superpower of Europe. It had the largest army, the most gold, and the most sophisticated culture. But beneath the gilded surface of Versailles, the mathematics of the nation had already collapsed. The crown was bankrupt, borrowing money just to pay the interest on previous loans. The nobility, the top 1% of the day, lived in a separate reality, tax-exempt and insulated from the economic pain of the masses. And the working class was spending 50% of their daily wage just to buy bread. After the hailstorm, that number didn't stay at 50%. By the spring of 1789, the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread, the fuel of the human engine, rose to 88% of a laborer's daily income. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine working a 12-hour shift, and at the end of the day, 88% of what you earned is gone just to feed yourself for tomorrow. You have 12% left for rent, for clothes, for fuel, for your children. You cannot survive that math. When the mathematics of survival break, the social contract breaks. We are taught in school that the French Revolution was about liberty, equality, and fraternity. That is the Disney version. The French Revolution was a bread riot that never stopped. It was a financial collapse that morphed into a murder spree. It was what happens when the gap between the asset owners and the wage earners becomes so wide that the system snaps. And right now, in 2025, you are standing in the shadow of that same hailstorm. Look at the American economy today. We are told that the stock market is at record highs. We are told that unemployment is low. We are told that the crisis was averted. But if you look at your own bank account, if you look at the price of rent, the price of ground beef, the price of insurance, you feel something different. You feel the same tightening that a Parisian peasant felt in the winter of 1788. The data confirms your feeling. Today, we are going to look at the terrifying parallel between the collapse of the French monarchy and the current state of the global financial system. We are going to look at the bread threshold, the exact mathematical point where a population stops believing in the system and starts burning it down. We are going to prove to you that the year 2025 is not a new era. It is a historical loop. The specific numbers have changed. The currency has changed. But the pattern is identical. We are living through the 1788 signal. And if history is a guide, the storm has not even begun. To understand why this crash is inevitable, we have to peel back the curtain on the mystery of the invisible tax. In 1789, the tax was obvious. The tax collector came to your door and took your grain. Today, the tax is hidden. It is hidden in the price of your mortgage. It is hidden in the shrinkflation of your groceries. It is hidden in the interest rate of your credit card. But the result is the same. The transfer of wealth from the many to the few has reached a velocity that physics cannot sustain. Let us go back to the mud of 1788. When the harvest failed, the reaction of the French government was the first mistake in a chain of catastrophes. The king, Louis XVI, was not an evil man. He was simply incompetent and surrounded by a system that made reform impossible. His finance ministers looked at the budget and saw a sea of red ink. France had spent a fortune financing the American Revolution, helping the United States break free from Britain. That war debt was the anvil around the neck of the French economy. By 1788, 50% of all tax revenue collected by the French king went directly to paying interest on the national debt. Not to the army, not to roads, not to the people, to the bankers. Does that sound familiar? In 2025, the United States government is approaching a mathematical event horizon where the interest on the national debt exceeds the defense budget. We are borrowing trillions of dollars during peacetime, not to build things, but to pay the bondholders who own our debt. The United States is effectively financing its own lifestyle on a credit card that can never be paid off. In France, this debt trap forced the king to squeeze the peasantry. He could not tax the nobles because they had legal exemptions. He could not tax the church because they owned 10% of the land and paid zero taxes. So the entire burden fell on the third estate, the 98% of the population who worked for a living. This created a two-tier society. In Tier 1, you had the aristocracy. They did not work. They owned assets. They owned land. They owned the government bonds that paid them interest. When the price of grain went up, they got richer because they owned the grain. In Tier 2, you had the people. They sold their labor for wages. When the price of grain went up, they starved because their wages did not move. Now, look at 2025. We have a new aristocracy. They do not wear powdered wigs or silk breeches. They wear Patagonia vests and sit in boardrooms in Silicon Valley and Wall Street. They are the asset class. When the Federal Reserve prints money to save the economy, that money flows directly into the prices of assets like stocks, bonds, and real estate. If you own assets, you are in Tier 1. The inflation that crushes the poor actually inflates your net worth. Your house goes up in value. Your stock portfolio doubles. You are the modern noble, exempt from the reality of the crisis. If you earn a wage, you are in Tier 2. You are the modern peasant. You work for dollars, but the dollars are losing value every single second. You try to save, but the cost of a house moves away from you faster than you can run. In 1788, the peasant looked at the chateau on the hill and wondered why the lights were always on while his children sat in the dark. In 2025, the average American looks at the institutional investors buying up entire neighborhoods and wonders why he is renting a lifestyle his parents could afford to own on a single income. The anger is the same. The math is the same. But here is where the story gets dark. In France, the hunger was physical. You could see the ribs of the children in the streets of Paris. In the modern West, the hunger is financial. You do not see starving children in the streets. You see tent cities. You see young professionals living in their cars. You see a generation, Gen Z and millennials, who have accepted that they will never own a home. This financial hunger is just as volatile as physical hunger. It just takes longer to explode. In the months leading up to the revolution, the French countryside was filled with vagabonds, people who had lost their farms and were wandering the roads looking for work. Today, we have the gig economy. We have millions of people piecing together 3 or 4 jobs just to stay solvent, driving cars for strangers, delivering food, freelancing, living with zero safety net. The fragility of the system in 1789 was absolute. One bad harvest, one hailstorm, and the civilized veneer of France evaporated. We are one bad shock away from the same evaporation. Imagine if the internet goes down for 3 days. Imagine if the supply chain breaks for a week. Imagine if the credit card processing system halts. We are not as far from the mud of 1788 as we think. We have just paved over it with digital conveniences. To understand the inevitability of the crash, we must look at the doom pattern of the French currency. Before the revolution, France used a complex system of gold and silver coins. It was honest money, but there was not enough of it. The king was broke. The merchants were broke. The economy had ground to a halt because liquidity had dried up. This is the deflationary trap. It happens right before the hyperinflation. In 2025, we see signs of this deflation in the real economy, masked by inflation in the asset economy. The price of televisions is down. The price of digital goods is down. But the price of everything you actually need, like shelter, energy, and food, is skyrocketing. This bifurcated inflation squeezes the middle class from both ends. In 1789, the French government decided they needed a solution. They needed money, and they needed it fast. They could not mine more gold. So they looked at the biggest asset pool in the country, the Catholic Church. The revolutionary government confiscated all the land owned by the church. It was a massive wealth transfer. To monetize this land, they issued paper certificates called assignats. The assignat was supposed to be a bond. It was backed by the value of the land. It seemed like a genius idea. They thought, we have land, we issue paper backed by the land, we pay off the debt, and the economy starts moving again. This is the exact logic of quantitative easing. When the Federal Reserve buys mortgage-backed securities, they are doing the same thing. They are printing dollars backed by the value of the housing market, and the government is promised to pay. It is a way to create money out of thin air, using debt as the collateral. At first, the assignat worked. The economy boomed. People had money to spend. The shops in Paris were busy. The National Assembly congratulated themselves. They had solved the crisis without pain. But paper money is a drug. The initial high is euphoria. The withdrawal is death. The government spent the first batch of assignats, but the debt was still there. The war was still expensive. The people were still hungry. So they printed more and more. By 1790, there were millions of assignats in circulation. The people started to notice something. The price of bread was not going down. It was going up. Why? Because the more paper money you print, the less each piece of paper is worth. The French government made it a crime to refuse assignats. They made it a crime to sell gold. They tried to force the market to accept their fake reality. This is the yield curve control of the 18th century. Today, we see central banks trying to force the market to accept their reality. They manipulate interest rates. They manipulate bond yields. They tell us that inflation is transitory. They tell us that 2% inflation is healthy. But the market always finds the truth. In revolutionary France, the truth was found in the bakeries. The baker did not want your paper assignat. He wanted silver. If you wanted to pay in paper, the price of the loaf doubled. This led to the two-price system, the official price and the real price. In 2025, look at the housing market. There's the official inflation rate, maybe 3 or 4%. And then there is the real inflation rate of housing, 7, 8, 10% a year. If you're trying to buy a house with a wage that grows at the official rate, you are paying with assignats. The seller wants real value. The gap between the official economy and the real economy is where the revolution breeds. By 1793, the assignat had lost 90% of its value. The government's response was not to stop printing, it was to print faster. They printed denominations of thousands, then tens of thousands. And then came the terror. When money dies, society resorts to force. The French government passed the law of the general maximum. This was a price control law. It set a maximum price for bread, for grain, for firewood. It made it illegal to charge the market rate. This sounds like a protection for the poor. It sounds compassionate. It sounds like they are stopping the greedy merchants from gouging the people. But economics has laws that are stronger than the laws of men. When you force a baker to sell bread at a loss, he stops baking bread. The law of the maximum did not lower prices. It created empty shelves. The farmers refused to bring their grain to Paris because the government forced them to sell it for worthless paper. So Paris starved. Not because there was not enough food in France, but because the price mechanism had been destroyed. We are seeing the early stages of this price control thinking in 2025. We hear calls for rent control. We hear calls for caps on grocery prices. We hear politicians blaming corporate greed for inflation. It is an easy sell. It feels good to blame the greedy corporation. But price controls are the death rattle of a dying currency. They are the government admitting that the money is broken, so they have to break the market to hide it. The historical parallel creates a terrifying roadmap. Step 1 is massive debt. Step 2 is money printing to service debt. Step 3 is inflation spikes. Step 4 is price controls and blame. Step 5 is shortages and supply chain collapse. We are currently hovering between Step 3 and Step 4. The mystery factor here is the speed. In the 18th century, information traveled at the speed of a horse. Today, it travels at the speed of light. The collapse of the assignat took 7 years. The collapse of a modern currency could happen in 7 days. We saw a preview of this with the Silicon Valley Bank crash. A rumor started on Twitter. Billions of dollars were withdrawn in hours. Imagine that speed applied to the US dollar itself. Imagine a moment where the foreign holders of US debt, like China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia, decide that the assignat of the 21st century is no longer a store of value. They do not have to invade. They just have to sell. If the bond market crashes, the interest rates spike. If interest rates spike, the housing market freezes. If housing freezes, the banking system fails. And if the banking system fails, the supply chain stops. You go to the grocery store and the shelves are empty. Not because of a harvest failure, but because the payment system does not work. This is the modern famine. It is a famine of liquidity. In 1789, the women of Paris marched on Versailles because they could not feed their children. They were known as the poissardes, the fish market women. They were tough, they were angry, and they dragged the king back to Paris to face the music. Who will be the poissardes of 2025? It will not be fishwives. It will be the suburban middle class. It will be the people who followed all the rules, went to college, took on the debt, bought the house, and then found themselves underwater, unable to afford the groceries to put in the fridge. When the middle class breaks, the regime falls. The poor are always used to suffering. The rich are insulated. But the middle class has everything to lose, and when they realize it is gone, their rage is calculated and destructive. We are watching the erosion of the middle class in real time. We are watching the creation of a neo-feudal society where you either own the capital or you serve the capital. Now, let us deepen the mystery. We know the system is rigged. We know the math does not work. But why does it continue? Why has it not collapsed yet? The answer lies in the illusion of wealth. In the years before the French Revolution, Paris was actually booming. There was construction everywhere. The rich were building magnificent mansions. The theaters were full. The fashion was extravagant. If you walked through the rich districts in 1788, you would not think this was a country on the brink of death. You would see what economists call a crack-up boom. When a currency is dying, people rush to spend it. They buy hard assets. They buy luxury goods. They buy anything that will hold value better than the money itself. This creates a superficial prosperity. The stock market goes up. Real estate prices go up. Art prices go up. Does this sound like 2025? We look at the S&P 500 hitting all-time highs and we think the economy is strong. We are wrong. The stock market is not the economy. The stock market is a measure of how much inflation is being pumped into the asset class. The French nobility were dancing on a volcano. They were celebrating their paper wealth while the foundation of the country turned to ash. There's a famous story about Marie Antoinette. We all know the line about eating cake. Historians say she probably never said it. But the sentiment was real. It was not malice, it was ignorance. She genuinely did not understand how a person could not afford bread. She lived in a world where food just appeared on the table. Today, the disconnect between the decision makers and the reality of the street is absolute. The central bankers look at their spreadsheets. They see aggregate demand and CPI. They do not see the family putting groceries back on the shelf because the card declined. This blindness is the final ingredient in the disaster cocktail. Let us look at the tax of the invisible. In 1789, the peasants paid land tax, income tax, salt tax, and consumption tax. In 2025, you pay federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security tax, Medicare tax, property tax, sales tax, gas tax, and utility tax. But the biggest tax is not on that list. The biggest tax is inflation. When the government prints $1 trillion, they are diluting your savings. If you have $10,000 in the bank and inflation is 10%, the government just stole $1,000 from you without passing a law, without a vote, without sending a bill. This is the feudalism of the 21st century. The inflation tax falls hardest on the poor and the middle class because they hold cash. The rich do not hold cash. They hold assets, so inflation actually helps them. This transfer of wealth is the engine of inequality, and inequality is the engine of revolution. In 1789, the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality in France, was high. Today in the United States, the wealth inequality is mathematically more extreme than it was in France under Louis XVI. The only reason we have not seen guillotines yet is because the average standard of living is higher. A poor American today has a smartphone and air conditioning. A poor Frenchman in 1789 had rickets and a mud floor, but the relative deprivation is the same. Humans judge their status by looking at their neighbors. And when you see a class of people becoming billionaires by betting on digital coins or receiving government bailouts while you work 60 hours a week and cannot afford a home, the psychological contract snaps. This is the psychological guillotine. Before the violence starts in the streets, it starts in the mind. It starts with a loss of legitimacy. The people stop respecting the institutions. In France, the people loved the king for centuries. He was the father of the nation. But by 1791, they were drawing cartoons of him as a pig. They mocked the queen. They laughed at the judges. Look at the trust in American institutions today. Congress is in the single digits. The media is at its lowest trust in history. The banks are distrusted. The Supreme Court is polarized. The legitimacy is gone. We are operating on inertia. The French Revolution did not happen because everyone became a radical overnight. It happened because the center collapsed. The moderate people, the shopkeepers, the lawyers, the farmers, realized that the current system could not guarantee their survival. So they sided with the radicals. In 2025, the center is collapsing. The political polarization is not the cause, it is the symptom. It is the sound of people searching for a lifeboat because they know the ship is sinking. And what happens when the ship goes down? The French Revolution teaches us that the chaos moves in waves. First, the liberal phase. This is where everyone is optimistic. They think they will fix the Constitution and tax the rich. This is the phase of hope. Then, the radical phase. The reforms fail, the money collapses, the war starts, the radicals take over. They decide the problem is not the system, but the traitors. The guillotine starts falling. The king is executed. The terror begins. Then, the reactionary phase. The people are exhausted by the blood. They want order. They do not care about liberty anymore. They just want bread and stability. And finally, the Napoleonic phase. A strong man emerges. A dictator who promises to restore glory and order at the point of a sword. Where are we in this cycle? We are in the pre-1789 tension. We are in the phase where the grievances are being written. We are in the phase where the hail is falling and the government is telling us it is just a light rain. But the most chilling parallel is the Great Fear. In the summer of 1789, a panic swept across France. Rumors spread that brigands were coming to destroy the crops. Peasants armed themselves with pitchforks and scythes. They attacked the chateaux, not out of political ideology, but out of pure terror. They burned the feudal records, the papers that said who owed what debt to whom. This is the key. They did not just kill the nobles, they burned the debt records. If a financial collapse happens in 2025, what is the modern version of burning the feudal records? It is the hacking of the banking servers. It is the default on student loans. It is the mass refusal to pay credit card debt. It is a debt jubilee by force. If 50 million Americans simply stop paying their debts tomorrow, the system ends. The police cannot arrest 50 million people. The banks cannot foreclose on 50 million homes. This is the nuclear option of the peasantry. And in a world of $317 trillion of global debt, it is the scenario that keeps the central bankers awake at night. The system relies on your consent. It relies on you believing that you must pay the mortgage, that you must pay the student loan. In 1789, the French peasant realized he did not have to pay the lord. And once that idea took root, no army in Europe could stop it. So how does this story end? If we are trapped in a history loop, we need to look at the exit. The French Revolution ended, but at a terrible cost. It took decades for the French economy to recover. The currency was destroyed, a generation of young men died, but the feudal system was destroyed. The aristocracy never truly regained their power. The land was redistributed. The crisis of 2025 will likely result in a similar restructuring. It is inevitable. The debt cannot be paid. The inequality cannot be sustained. The only question is how the reset happens. There are 3 paths. Path 1 is the inflationary reset. This is the Assignat path. The government prints money until the dollar loses its status as the world reserve currency. Your debts are wiped out, but so are your savings. The middle class is vaporized. The assets are bought up by foreign powers or the ultra-wealthy who hold gold and land. This is the path of least resistance for politicians. It is the slow boil. Path 2 is the deflationary collapse. The government tries to save the currency by raising rates and stopping the printer. This triggers a Great Depression-style crash. Defaults cascade. Banks close. Unemployment hits 25%. This is the 1929 path. It clears the rot, but it causes massive social suffering and usually leads to war. Path 3 is the new social contract. This is the path of revolution, hopefully peaceful. But history suggests otherwise. It involves a fundamental change in how money works. Maybe it is a return to hard money. Maybe it is a decentralized crypto economy that bypasses the central banks. Maybe it is a tax system that targets assets instead of wages. The French Revolution was a messy, bloody attempt to find path 3. We have the advantage of hindsight. We can see the iceberg. We know what happens when you ignore the bread price. But the terrifying truth of narrative economics is that humans rarely learn. We differ from the animals because we can tell stories, but we are like the animals because we follow the herd. The herd is currently grazing near the cliff edge. The mystery we promised to solve was this: why do we feel like the world is ending when the numbers say it is fine? The answer is because you are sensing the barometric pressure drop before the hurricane. You are sensing the 1788 signal. Your instincts are right. The official numbers are the lie. The struggle to buy groceries is the truth. In 1789, the symbol of the old world was the Bastille. It was a prison that held only 7 prisoners, but it represented the tyranny of the state. When the people tore it down, they were not just freeing the prisoners, they were tearing down the idea that they were powerless. What is the Bastille of 2025? Is it the Federal Reserve? Is it the massive asset management firms? Is it the algorithm that decides your credit score? We do not know yet. But we know that when the bread gets too expensive, the people start looking for bricks to pull. The lesson of 1788 is simple. You cannot eat GDP. You cannot live in the stock market. And you cannot print your way out of a reality check. The storm is here. The hail is falling. The only question left is, do you have an umbrella? Or are you waiting for the king to save you? Because the king is broke. And the queens are all out of cake. History is a circle, and we are coming around to the dark side of the loop.